The iron gates did not welcome him. They stood as a jagged, rusted barrier between the life Elias had endured and the life he intended to forge. He stood still, the wind biting at his skin, his hands shaking so violently he had to clench them into fists to keep the key from falling. 10 years. 10 years of living in the shadows, of listening to the jeers of people who saw nothing but a man without a future. He looked at the gate, then down at his palm. The rusted key felt heavier than iron, cold and biting against his skin. It was the only thing he had managed to keep through the long, hungry winters. He stepped forward, the gravel crunching under his boots, and pressed the metal edge into the keyhole. It resisted. He leaned his weight against the iron, his muscles straining, his breath hitching as the mechanism groaned. He had spent a decade dreaming of this exact second. He did not come with hope, which felt too fragile a thing to carry. He came with a singular, sharp-edged resolve. He gripped the bow of the key, twisted his wrist, and felt the internal tumbler shift. The lock clicked. A sharp report in the silence of the street. The gate swung inward, revealing the dark void of the workshop beyond. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the smell of wet stone and settled dust. Elias crossed the threshold, his boots sounding hollow against the cracked floorboards. Shafts of pale light pierced through the broken roof, illuminating swirling particles that danced in the gloom. At first glance, it was a graveyard of industry. Rusted frames stood like skeletons, and piles of discarded metal lay scattered in every corner. He felt the cold dampness of the room seep into his bones, and for a heartbeat, the reality of the decay hit him with the force of a physical blow. He stood motionless, watching the shadows stretch across the empty workbenches. But then, he adjusted his stance. He looked past the rust. He looked through the ruin. Where others saw only the wreckage of a forgotten era, his eyes found the geometry of something new. He moved toward the center of the room, his gaze locking onto a sturdy, flat-topped table that had survived the collapse. He reached out, clearing away a layer of grime with his palm, and felt the solid resistance of the wood beneath. The space was no longer a tomb. It was a foundation. He stood in the center of the silence, his breathing steadying, the initial doubt dissolving into a sharp, focused clarity. He was home. Elias pulled his bag onto the table, the canvas strap groaning under the weight. He withdrew the notebook. Its edges were frayed, the paper yellowed and thin, holding the weight of a decade of silent contemplation. He laid it flat, smoothing the page with his palm until it rested perfectly still. He reached for a piece of charcoal, feeling the grit of it against his thumb. For a few seconds, he did not move. The sheer magnitude of what he intended to build pressed against his lungs. He stared at the blank white expanse, his fingers tightening around the charcoal until his knuckles turned white. Then, he exhaled. The tension snapped. He pressed the tip to the paper and dragged it in a clean, sharp arc. The first line appeared. It was not a tentative stroke, but a declaration. His hand gained momentum, moving with a rhythm that felt like an extension of his own pulse. He drew gears, shafts, and levers, his mind translating impossible theories into concrete geometry. He had no money to buy materials, no reputation to open doors, and no partners to share the burden. He had only the friction of charcoal on paper, and a faith that burned hotter than the biting cold of the workshop. Every line he etched was a step away from his past. He did not pause to doubt. He simply drew, line by line, until the page was a map of his own survival. The first week passed in a blur of silence and shadow. By the third day, the hunger became a physical presence, a sharp, gnawing ache that clawed at his concentration. His hands began to tremble when he reached for his tools, and his stomach cramped with every movement. He stood up, pacing the length of the workshop, trying to ignore the way the emptiness made his head spin. He knew that if he faltered now, the machine would remain a collection of lines on a page. He stopped in the center of the room, squeezed his eyes shut, and began to speak. He repeated a single rhythmic phrase under his breath, a steady mantra meant to anchor his mind against the biological rebellion. He whispered it until the words drowned out the demand for food. He whispered it until the shaking in his fingers ceased. He was training his mind to treat the body as a secondary concern, a vessel to be managed rather than a master to be obeyed. The hunger did not vanish, but it lost its command. He returned to the table, his movements precise and deliberate. He had mastered the internal landscape, Now, he was ready to face the metal. The work required more than just focus. It demanded a precision he did not yet possess. Elias cleared the table of his sketches and replaced them with stacks of ancient manuals he had scavenged from the city outskirts. The books were heavy, their spines cracked, and the ink on the pages was faded to a pale, difficult gray. He lit a single candle, placing it strategically to cut through the oppressive shadows of the workshop. He read for hours, his eyes straining against the flickering flame. He encountered terms he did not recognize and diagrams that defied his current understanding of physics. He did not skip the difficult passages. He read them 3 times, 4 times, until the concepts began to lock into place. He treated each page like a puzzle, stripping away the archaic terminology to reach the raw mechanical truth beneath. He kept a secondary notebook open, transcribing the complex theories into his own simplified, logical shorthand. The general knowledge of how things worked was no longer enough. He was creating a specialized map of gears and tension. As the candle burned down to a pool of wax, the abstract calculations on his desk shifted into a coherent plan. He had turned the silence of the library into the language of the machine. The first major assembly test ended with a violent, metallic shriek. Elias watched as the primary gear tooth sheared off, sending a spray of metal fragments across the workbench. The entire mechanism seized, the tension of the main spring snapping back into a dead, silent coil. He froze, his hands still gripping the crank, feeling the sudden loss of resistance in his palm. The failure was absolute. He pulled his hand back as if burned, staring at the jagged, broken teeth of the gear. The urge to sweep the entire project into the refuse bin was a heavy, suffocating weight. Instead, he forced himself to breathe. He picked up the broken pieces, turning them over in his fingers to inspect the fracture point. The steel was brittle, but the frame was sound. He pushed the wreckage aside and reached into the corner where he kept a pile of discarded scrap. He began to compare the failed Geomet 15 against the irregular shapes of the metal scraps. He took a heavy file and a hand drill, setting to work on a curved piece of salvaged iron. He was not just fixing a broken part, he was inventing a new geometry. The failure was no longer a wall, but a doorway to a more efficient design. He worked through the remainder of the night, his rhythm steady, turning the wreckage of his first attempt into the foundation of his second. Elias began every morning with a ritual of absolute control. He laid out his tools in precise, parallel lines on the workbench. He wrote his goals on a scrap of parchment, dividing the day into 4-hour blocks: design, fabrication, testing, and refinement. He ignored the gnawing ache of hunger and the growing pile of unpaid bills. When he stepped outside for water, the townspeople watched him with open disdain. A man leaned over a fence and spat, calling his work a fool's errand. Elias did not argue or look away. He kept his stride constant and his face neutral, treating the insults like wind against a stone. He returned to the workshop and locked the door. He checked his list. He prioritized the most unstable components first, refusing to settle for easy progress. He forced himself to make a firm decision at every junction: continue or stop. He chose to continue. He tracked his efficiency, noting every minute lost to hesitation. He was building a barrier against the outside world, brick by brick, gear by gear. By sunset, he had finished 3 tasks that previously took him a week. The doubt of the city was real, but his plan was stronger. He tightened his grip on the file, set his next objective, and began again. The sky turned a bruised, heavy gray by mid-afternoon. Rain did not begin with a drizzle. It arrived as a sudden, violent deluge that hammered against the workshop roof. Elias was hunched over his bench, calibrating the main drive when the first leak appeared. A thin, dark stream of water traced a path down the rafter and landed directly on his exposed blueprints. He scrambled to move them, but the roof groaned under the weight of the downpour. A section of rotting timber snapped. A torrent of freezing water poured through the gap, drenching the workbench in seconds. He grabbed a heavy canvas sheet, lunging to cover the delicate gear assembly, but the water was faster. It pooled in the center of his desk, flooding the intricate mechanism he had spent weeks perfecting. He stood back as the prototypes hissed and sputtered, oil washing away into the grime of the floor. The sound of the rain against the metal roof was deafening, drowning out his own breathing. He watched the water drip from the edge of his table. His early work, the foundation of his progress, was slick with mud and debris. The workshop was no longer a sanctuary. It was a flooded basin of ruined labor. Elias did not move. He stood in the center of the wreckage, listening to the relentless rhythm of the storm. Elias did not wipe the water from his face. He watched the last of the storm drain through the floorboards. He stepped into the puddles, his boots leaving dark prints on the grime. He reached into the wreckage on the workbench, moving aside twisted metal and saturated paper. His fingers searched through the silt until they gripped a small brass gear. It was intact. He wiped it against his palm and set it on a dry corner of the table. That single piece became his anchor. He cleared the bench, pushing the ruined prototypes into a pile of scrap. He did not look at the damage as a loss. He looked at it as a clearance of errors. He picked up a broom and swept the standing water toward the door, forcing the workshop back to a state of order. He moved with a methodical, rhythmic pace, clearing the space of every trace of the flood. He gathered the salvaged metal, organizing it by size and potential utility. He reached for his notebook, turning to a clean page. He did not dwell on the time lost. He calculated the materials remaining, drafted a new sequence of assembly, and gripped his pencil. The uncertainty of the storm had passed. He breathed in the air, now sharp with the smell of wet iron, and pushed the first gear into place. Elias looked at the gear assembly on his table. It lacked the precision he needed to move forward. He realized his own hands could not bridge the gap between imagination and physics alone. He rolled up his sketches, secured them with a leather strip, and stepped out into the city. He walked past the bustling market, his eyes scanning the storefronts until he found a sign hanging by a single iron chain. A clockmaker. He pushed the door open, the bell chiming against the quiet interior. The air inside smelled of oil and polished brass. An old man sat at a workbench, a jeweler's loop pressed against his eye, fine tweezers held in steady hands. Elias approached the counter, his pulse quickening. He placed the sketches down, unrolling them to reveal the complex, layered drawings. The clockmaker paused. He set his tools aside and bent over the paper, tracing the lines with a calloused finger. He spent a long minute in total silence, his eyes darting across the calculated tensions and proposed movements. Finally, he looked up, meeting Elias's gaze directly. There were no words required. The clockmaker shifted his stool, clearing a space for Elias to sit beside him. A quiet, firm nod passed between them. The work was no longer a solitary burden. The shop floor became a landscape of brass shavings and iron rods. Elias held the frame steady while the clockmaker filed a gear tooth by a fraction of a millimeter. They worked in a sequence that defied their individual limits. When Elias proposed a linkage that ignored load-bearing stress, the clockmaker pointed to the pivot point, his thumb pressing into the metal to show the inevitable shear. They did not argue. They recalculated. Elias sketched a new joint while the clockmaker heated the steel, tempering the metal to handle the rotational force. They operated as a single unit, their hands moving in sync around the growing assembly. A piston refused to seat properly, locking against the cylinder wall. Elias felt the familiar rise of frustration, but the clockmaker grabbed a fine-grade file and smoothed the inner housing, his rhythm steadying Elias. They slotted the piston back into place. It slid home with a clean, metallic click. The machine began to take shape, a dense web of interlocking parts that moved with fluid, precise motion. They tightened the final locking nut on the central shaft, watching as the weight held perfectly. What was once a collection of chaotic components now stood as a solid, functional engine of gears and pistons. They had turned their impossible design into a physical reality. Outside the workshop walls, the city had begun to notice. Laughter drifted through the cracked window panes, sharp and repetitive. Passers-by would stop, point at the rusted door, and shout comments about the dreamer and his scrap pile. The noise was constant. It vibrated through the floorboards and sat heavy in the air. Elias felt the familiar heat of irritation rising in his chest. He stopped his work, his grip tightening on the wrench until his knuckles turned white. The clockmaker tapped the table, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the external din. Elias took a breath. He pulled a heavy canvas cloth across the window, sealing off the sight of the street, and pressed his forehead against the cold workbench. He began to visualize the engine, ignoring the shouting until the voices became nothing more than background static. He reached for the smallest gear, his fingers moving with a sudden, icy stillness. Every insult from the street was stripped away, replaced by the friction of metal on metal. He did not look up. He did not react. He channeled the frustration into the file, shaving the gear teeth to a razor-sharp edge. The work became his only reality, precise and untouchable. The candles burned low, casting long, jumping shadows across the workbench. Elias reached for a brass pin, but his hand betrayed him, twitching at the wrong moment. The pin clattered against the floor, disappearing into the dust. He stared at the spot, his eyelids heavy, his vision swimming in the dim light. The clockmaker did not speak. He simply pushed a fresh oil lamp toward Elias, the light cutting through the growing haze of fatigue. Elias wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of grease across his skin. He knelt, his knees popping against the hard floor, and retrieved the pin. His pulse throbbed in his fingertips, a rhythmic reminder of his limits. He climbed back onto the stool, bracing his elbows against the table to stop the shaking. He did not look at the clock or the window. He looked only at the aperture of the main housing. He picked up the tweezers. His breath slowed, matching the steady, ticking cadence of the clockmaker's movements. He held the pin, guided it into the microscopic opening, and pressed. The metal seated with a dull thud. He did not pause to stretch. He reached for the next component, his focus narrowing until the world outside the workshop ceased to exist entirely. The air inside the workshop grew still and thick, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The clockmaker set his tools down with a soft metallic click, stepped back into the shadows, and left the workbench to Elias. 10 years of labor, of hunger, and of ridicule now converged into the space of a few inches. The machine sat before him, a complex skeleton of gears and levers. Elias picked up the final iron plate. His palms were dry, his grip absolute. He lowered the piece, feeling the subtle resistance of the fit. It was not just a mechanical connection. It was the physical summation of every failed prototype and every night spent reading by candlelight. The silence in the room became absolute, punctuated only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of the clockmaker's own devices. Elias did not rush. He aligned the bolt holes with surgical precision. The weight of his decade-long ambition pressed down on his shoulders, yet he stood unmoving. Every muscle in his body remained locked in place, bracing against the significance of the final seal. He held the plate suspended, waiting for the exact alignment, his eyes scanning the gaps. The workshop lights flickered, casting sharp, static shadows across the brass. But he did not blink. He was ready. Elias applied the wrench. He felt the threads catch, the metal biting into the frame with a final, satisfying resistance. He turned the bolt until it seated flush against the brass housing. It was done. The assembly was complete. He stood back, his chest rising and falling in the quiet room. Yet, as he reached to clear his tools, his hand stopped midair. An unnatural pull, sharp and immediate, dragged his fingers toward the central housing. It was not a thought. It was a physical demand. He resisted for a second, his mind locked on the blueprints he had memorized, but his hand moved anyway. He bypassed the primary lock and reached for the mainspring adjustment dial. The metal felt cold against his skin. He twisted the dial 1 millimeter, then another, listening to the microscopic clicks beneath his thumb. The tension changed, shifting the internal weight of the entire mechanism. He stopped. His pulse hammered against his wrist as he felt the machine settle into a state of perfect equilibrium. He did not question why he had altered the design, he simply knew. He pulled his hand away, his fingers tingling, and stared at the dial. The machine stood silent, waiting for the final movement. Elias reached for the iron crank. His palms were slick with sweat, his skin tight against the rough metal surface. He wrapped his fingers around the grip, locking his wrist into a rigid brace. His heart hammered a frantic, rhythmic beat against his ribs, a physical manifestation of 10 years of accumulated pressure. He looked at the machine. It remained motionless, a dormant arrangement of gears and shafts. For a single heartbeat, he stood frozen, his breath hitching in his throat. He weighed the potential for failure against the absolute certainty of his work. The doubt was a physical weight, pulling at his shoulders, but he leaned into it. He exhaled a long, steady breath. He did not look away. He planted his boots firmly against the floorboards, shifted his center of gravity, and pushed. His shoulder muscles bunched under the strain. He forced the crank forward. The metal groaned, a deep, resonant friction echoing through the hollow workshop. He kept the pressure constant, refusing to stutter. The resistance gave way. The crank completed its first full rotation, the sound vibrating up his arm and through his very bones. He did not stop. He did not hesitate. He pressed the momentum forward. The crank spun faster under his grip. Suddenly, a jarring metallic clatter erupted from the central casing, a sound of grinding teeth that threatened to shatter his progress. Elias lunged, his weight slamming against the frame to dampen the violent vibration. He held the structure steady, his muscles screaming against the torque as he adjusted the release valve with his free hand. The grinding slowed, smoothed, and then vanished. A soft, magnetic click followed. He pulled his hand back, watching. The internal shafts began to rotate on their own. A seamless, interlocking dance of steel. A low-frequency hum rose from the floorboards, climbing the walls until the entire workshop resonated with the sound. It was steady. It was rhythmic. It was alive. Elias stepped back, his hands trembling as he wiped oil and grime from his forehead. The machine pulsed with light and motion, a living testament to every failed prototype and every sleepless night. He stood in the center of the vibration, his chest expanding as the noise filled the space, drowning out the silence of the city outside. The vision was no longer a sketch on paper. It was a physical force, churning with relentless, perfect energy. Elias reached out, his fingertips grazing the outer casing of the device. The metal was warm, humming with a kinetic intensity that traveled straight into his skin. He did not pull away. Instead, he pressed his palms firmly against the surface, feeling the precise, calculated rhythm of every gear he had fashioned by hand. The vibration traveled up his arms, settling into his chest, sinking with his own steady breathing. He looked at his hands, calloused, stained with grease, scarred from the work, and saw them differently. These were no longer the hands of a man defined by poverty or the rejection of the town. They were instruments of precision, capable of bending raw scrap into functional reality. He straightened his spine, the fatigue of the last 10 years suddenly replaced by a sharp, clear-eyed focus. He walked around the machine, checking the tension, adjusting a bolt with a single, fluid motion. Every movement was efficient. Every decision was deliberate. He realized the machine was merely a mirror. It was not the gears that held the power, but the capacity for persistence he had forged within himself. He stood tall in the center of the workshop, his shadow long against the wall, fully aware that he had moved beyond the limits he once believed were his reality. Elias pulled the worn notebook from his pocket, the one filled with desperate sketches and jagged lines from a decade of hunger. He flipped to the first page, where the ink was faded and the drawings were clumsy. He compared those early, unsure lines to the complex, silent movement of the machine before him. The contrast was absolute. He had arrived at these gates a decade ago as a man who owned nothing but a rusted key and a hollow sense of hope. He realized now that he had been trying to build a machine to prove his worth to a world that had forgotten him. But the machine was only a byproduct. The real work had happened in the long, freezing nights of failure, in the quiet discipline of ignoring his hunger, and in the refusal to walk away when the roof leaked and his designs were ruined. He tore the first page from the notebook, crumpled it, and dropped it into the scrap bin. He did not need the blueprints anymore. The knowledge was no longer on the paper. It was in his hands, his reflexes, and his unwavering resolve. He was no longer the man seeking entry. He was the man who had created the gate itself. Elias blew out the final candle, plunging the workshop into a sudden, deep gray. The silence felt different now. No longer a weight, but a space waiting to be filled. He walked to the iron gate, his boots striking the floor with a rhythmic, confident sound. He reached the gate, paused, and set the rusted key on the workbench. It was an artifact of a life he had already outgrown. He gripped the heavy iron, pushed, and the gate swung open with a smooth, effortless motion. Outside, the world was waking. The horizon had turned a pale, bruised violet, bleeding into a soft gold that washed over the city streets. Elias stepped across the threshold, leaving the dust and the shadows behind. The air was cool against his skin, carrying the scent of incoming rain and distant wood smoke. He looked down the empty street, past the houses that had once ignored his presence, and saw them not as barriers, but as structures waiting for new ideas. He drew a long, steady breath, felt the strength in his own limbs, and began to walk. The city remained the same, but the man moving through it was not. He had entered this place seeking a machine to change his life, but he left carrying the power to change everything else.